My name is Tracy Townsend, and at 34, I learned that the cruelest thing my mother could say fit into 8 words. I'd spent 6 years on fertility clinic waiting lists, 6 years of blood draws and hormone shots and phone calls that always ended the same way. Then I got pregnant. I stood at the family dinner table, 22 relatives around Diane Townsend's good china, and I said the sentence I'd rehearsed in the car for 40 minutes. I'm pregnant. My mother set down her fork. Let's hope this one is smarter than you. My sister Megan laughed so hard she covered her mouth with her napkin. My father Roger checked his watch. Can we eat now? I looked across the table at my husband Daniel. He nodded once. I reached into my coat pocket, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and stood up. It was a letter my obstetrician had written for me. 3 paragraphs, plain English, no medical jargon. By the third sentence, my mother was crying. But here's what none of them expected. By the time I sat back down, every person at that table knew exactly who the real disappointment was. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people meet impossible families, and quiet courage gets the last word. If a story has ever made you feel less alone at your own dinner table, you're in the right place. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. I work in healthcare data, not the glamorous kind. I don't hold stethoscopes or sign discharge papers. I sit in a windowless office on the 3rd floor of Ridgepoint Regional Hospital, and I read numbers until they confess what went wrong. Readmission spikes, billing anomalies, infection clusters buried in 3 years of intake forms. I'm the person who finds the one decimal everyone else scrolled past. The job requires patience, stubbornness, and a tolerance for being invisible. Those happen to be the 3 things the Townsend family raised me to be. My mother, Diane, taught 4th grade for 31 years. Megan followed her into medicine and kept climbing. OBGYN, chief resident by 30, partner track by 35. Roger sold industrial valves and came home at 6 and read the paper and said nothing. Somewhere between Megan's white coat ceremony and my associate degree in applied statistics, the family decided on our roles. Megan was the future. I was Tracy. When relatives asked what I did, my mother would wave her hand. She works with computers. Daniel was the first person who ever asked a follow-up question. We met at a hardware store. He was pricing cedar planks for a client's kitchen, and I was buying shelf brackets for an apartment I couldn't really afford. He builds furniture, custom cabinetry, mostly. And he listens the way wood listens to a lathe, patiently, letting the shape come. He proposed on a Tuesday morning over cold cereal because, he said, he didn't want me to think love had to be a performance. We bought a small house near the river. He built the dining table himself. And for 3 years before the tests and the clinics and the waiting, that table felt like enough. The trying started quiet. Then it got loud in all the wrong ways. The first year was just calendar math and cheap tests from the drugstore. The second year brought a referral. The third brought the first specialist and the first needle. And the first time Daniel held my hand while a technician measured something inside me with a wand. I lost the first pregnancy at 9 weeks. I was at work. I felt it happen in my office chair, and I drove myself to the ER because I didn't want to bother anyone. That's who I was then. The woman who apologized for bleeding. The second loss came at 11 weeks. The third at 7. Each time the clinic used the same phrase, unexplained recurrent loss. I wrote it on a sticky note once and stared at it like it was a data set missing its key variable. I never told my family. Not any of it. I told Daniel, obviously, and my friend Carla from the billing department, and the intake nurse who remembered my name by the 4th visit. But I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Megan. I definitely didn't tell Roger, because I knew exactly what they'd say. Diane would find a way to blame my diet, my job, my timing. Megan would tilt her head and use the word unfortunately in a sentence that also contained the words, your age. And Roger would check his watch. So I carried it alone. The appointments, the injections, the 6 a.m. blood draws that left bruises in the crook of my elbow I hid under long sleeves at Sunday dinners. 6 years of swallowing grief like it was tap water. I thought I was being strong. I was just being alone. The label started early. I struggled to read in first grade. Letters rearranged themselves like furniture in a room I kept walking into wrong. Nobody tested me. Diane was a teacher. You'd think she would have caught it. But what she caught instead was embarrassment. Parent-teacher night, my second grade year, she pulled my worksheet off Mrs. Kendall's bulletin board and folded it into her purse before anyone could see the red marks. Honestly, she said in the car, loud enough for Megan to hear, "How are you, my daughter?" That sentence worked like a stamp. It pressed into every report card, every family barbecue, every Thanksgiving where Megan recited her residency milestones and I passed the rolls. By the time I graduated community college, summa cum laude, not that anyone asked, the Townsend verdict was sealed. Tracy was sweet. Tracy tried hard. Tracy was not smart. Megan never missed an opening. At Easter 2 years ago, she poured herself a second glass of wine and smiled at me across the table. Tracy reads spreadsheets, she told Aunt Linda's husband. I read patience. Diane laughed. Roger reached for the bread. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood there for 4 minutes counting the tiles on the wall because I'd learned that counting was the thing that kept me from saying something I couldn't take back. What none of them ever looked at, because looking would have meant revising the story they'd all agreed on, was that the girl who couldn't read in second grade had taught herself to find patterns no one else could see. I was never the dumb one. I was the quiet one. And in my family, those sounded exactly the same. When I was 8, I found a box. It was on the top shelf of the hallway closet, pushed behind a stack of old quilts and a broken humidifier. Cedar. The kind Daniel would later teach me to identify by smell. Warm, dry, slightly sweet, like a drawer that hadn't been opened in a decade. Which it probably hadn't. I was looking for construction paper for a school project. I pulled the quilts forward and the box slid to the edge. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox. I remember the grain of the wood was dark with age. I had one hand on the lid when my mother appeared behind me. I didn't hear her come down the hall. She took the box from me so fast I felt the edge scrape my knuckle. "Don't ever touch that." She didn't yell. That was what made it stick. Diane Townsend yelled about dishes in the sink and shoes on the carpet and C-minuses in spelling. She yelled about everything that didn't matter. "This," she said quietly, and then she put it back behind the quilts and closed the closet door. I asked Megan about it once, years later, in the offhand way you ask about something you're pretending not to care about. She shrugged. "Mom's old stuff. Don't be nosy." I was 8. I wouldn't open that box for 26 more years. But the smell of cedar, warm, dry, slightly sweet, stayed with me like a word I'd heard once and couldn't quite define. You know the kind you keep turning over in your head, waiting for the sentence it belongs in. Daniel wanted me to tell someone. Not my mother, he knew better than that. But someone. A friend, a counselor, a stranger on a bus. Anyone who could help carry the weight I kept stacking neatly in the back of my skull like files in a cabinet nobody opens. "You don't have to earn this," he said one night, sitting on the edge of our bed while I organized injection supplies into labeled bags. Not with me. He meant love. He meant help. He meant the thing I'd spent 30 years believing had conditions attached. I kissed his forehead and told him I was fine. He didn't argue. He went to the garage and sanded a tabletop for 3 hours because that's what Daniel does with worry. He smooths it into wood. The treatments cost us $14,000 out of pocket the first year, $22,000 the second. Insurance covered diagnostic blood work and exactly nothing else. I kept a spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, procedure. Column C, cost. Column D, outcome. The outcome column was mostly one word: negative. I didn't cry at the results anymore. I just updated the spreadsheet and booked the next appointment. Perfectionism is a quiet disease. It looks like competence from the outside. It looks like a woman who has her life together, her budget color-coded, her pain filed alphabetically. But inside, It's just a person who believes that if she controls enough variables, the universe will eventually cooperate. I controlled everything I could. I scheduled every shot, tracked every hormone level, cross-referenced every study. And I told no one in my family because telling them would mean admitting I was failing at the one thing they already expected me to fail at. The fifth loss broke the pattern. Not because it hurt more. They all hurt the same, which is to say, completely, but because of what happened after. I was sitting in the clinic lobby filling out the same forms I'd filled out 4 times before when my phone buzzed. Diane. Tracy, your sister's being honored at the Medical Society dinner next Friday. Make sure you're there, and wear something appropriate. I set the phone face down on the clipboard and stared at the wall and thought, I am sitting in a waiting room after my 5th miscarriage, and my mother is worried about my dress code for Megan's award ceremony. That was the Tuesday I stopped being sad and started being methodical. My regular OB referred me to a specialist named Dr. Renata Hale. She ran a recurrent pregnancy loss clinic on the east side of the hospital, the same hospital where I worked, 2 floors below my office. Dr. Hale was 53, direct, and had zero interest in telling me to just relax and try again. At our first appointment, she pulled up my chart, looked at the 5 losses listed on my intake form, and said a sentence no one in my family ever had. This might not be your fault. She ordered a full genetic workup, karyotype analysis, thrombophilia panel, hormone cascade, the kind of testing that looks for the reason behind the reason. I sat in her office chair and felt something I hadn't felt in 5 years. Not hope. I'd beaten that out of myself. Curiosity. The same instinct that made me good at my job. Somewhere in my own blood, there was a number everyone had missed, and I was going to find it. I started reading medical journals the way I read hospital data. Slowly, systematically, looking for the variable nobody had isolated. Balanced translocations, inversions, mosaicism, thrombophilia cascades. I cross-referenced case studies against my own loss pattern. Week by week, I built a private spreadsheet with columns for genetic markers and recurrence rates. Daniel would come to bed at 11 and find me with the laptop balanced on my knees, a highlighter in my teeth, 3 browser tabs open to PubMed. You're doing it again, he'd say, not unkindly. Controlling. He was right, but this time, the controlling was aimed at something real. I told Megan about the genetic workup during a phone call. Casually, almost as an aside, the way you mention a dentist appointment. Her response was immediate. Tracy, stop playing doctor. You're overthinking this. She used her professional voice, the one she reserved for patients she'd already decided not to listen to. Sometimes these things just happen. Your body's trying. Give it time. My body had been trying for 6 years. Megan had spent 8 years in medical school and residency. She had delivered other people's babies for a living. And not once in 6 years had she suggested her own sister get tested for a chromosomal cause. Not once had she pulled up my chart, or offered to read my labs, or said the word karyotype over Sunday dinner. She had the training. She had the access. She just didn't have the interest. The irony would catch up to her later. For now, I hung up the phone and opened a new tab. If the doctor in my family wouldn't help me find the answer, the spreadsheet girl would. Diane called on a Wednesday. She didn't ask how I was. She never did. She asked if I was still going to those appointments. I told her I was seeing a new specialist. Silence. Then, Tracy, you need to stop this. It's embarrassing. Embarrassing. Not heartbreaking, not difficult, not worth discussing. Embarrassing. Like a stain on a tablecloth she'd have to explain to company. Some women just aren't meant for it, she added, her voice flat and final. The way she used to mark wrong answers in red pen. That's not a failure. It's just biology. I held the phone against my ear and let the sentence land. Just biology. Coming from the woman who taught 4th graders about plant life cycles and called it science. Coming from the woman who couldn't say the word miscarriage out loud. I wanted to say, you have no idea what my biology is doing. I wanted to say, a doctor just told me there might be a reason, a real one, with a name and a chromosome number. Instead, I said, "I'll think about it, Mom." And I hung up. Daniel was in the kitchen. He'd heard my side of the conversation. He didn't say anything. He put a mug of tea on the table and went back to his workbench. That night, I lay in bed and did what I always did. I counted. Not tiles, not breaths, but the number of times in my adult life my mother had asked me a genuine question about my health. I got to 4. 3 were about a sinus infection. 1 was about a mole on my shoulder. 0 were about the 6 years I'd spent trying to become a mother. 0. Dr. Hale called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon. She had my karyotype results on her screen and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "We found something," she said. She turned the monitor toward me. A diagram of chromosomes, mine, arranged in pairs. 2 of them had segments swapped. "You carry a balanced reciprocal translocation, chromosomes 7 and 11. She explained it plainly. My chromosomes were structurally rearranged but functional in my body. The problem showed up during reproduction. When my eggs formed, the translocation created a high probability of unbalanced embryos with too much or too little genetic material to survive. That was why I'd lost 5 pregnancies. Not because I waited too long, not because I was stressed, not because I didn't eat enough folate or think enough positive thoughts, or relax on a beach the way my mother once suggested over Thanksgiving dinner, because of a microscopic rearrangement in my DNA that had been there since before I was born. I sat very still. I'm good at sitting still. "Is there a path forward?" I asked. Dr. Hale nodded. Pre-implantation genetic testing, PGT. They could screen embryos during IVF and select the ones with balanced or normal chromosomes. The success rates were real, measurable. Not a guess, not a prayer, a number. I understood numbers. "One more thing," Dr. Hale added, setting down her pen. "This type of translocation is almost always inherited from a parent." She let that sit. "I'd recommend testing both of your parents if possible." I stared at the chromosome diagram on her screen. 2 segments swapped, invisible to the naked eye, passed down like a family heirloom no one had bothered to unwrap. Inherited from a parent. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for 20 minutes after that appointment. Engine off, hands on the wheel. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I tried to imagine asking Diane Townsend to submit to a blood draw so we could find out if she'd passed a chromosomal rearrangement to her daughter. I tried to picture her face, the tightening around the mouth, the way she'd fold her arms like a gate closing. I could hear her already. "There's nothing wrong with me. Or worse, stop looking for someone to blame." Dr. Hale had said it gently. Translocations are common. 1 in 500 people carry one. Most never know because it only becomes visible through recurrent loss or infertility. A person could live an entire life, raise children, retire, host Sunday dinners, and never realize they carried the rearrangement that had cost their daughter 6 years of grief. Unless they'd lost pregnancies too. Unless there were losses no one talked about. I thought about the hallway closet, the cedar box on the top shelf. My mother's voice, low and steady. "Don't ever touch that." I didn't drive home. I drove to Daniel's workshop. He was finishing a set of floating shelves for a client, cedar sawdust in his hair. I told him everything. The translocation, the PGT path, the inheritance question. He put down the sander. "It was never you." 4 words. He said them the same way Dr. Hale had. Like a fact. Like something that had always been true and just needed someone to say it out loud. I didn't cry. I filed the information, and somewhere behind it, the smell of cedar waited. Diane was downsizing. 31 years of teaching pension didn't stretch as far as she'd planned, and the 5-bedroom colonial was too much house for 2 people who hadn't spoken to each other in anything but logistics since the Reagan administration. She asked Megan and me to help sort through the upstairs rooms. Megan was working a double shift. Of course she was. So it was just me and my mother. 2 women who had never been comfortable in the same room, carrying boxes of old textbooks and yellowed curtains down narrow stairs. The house smelled like it always had. Pine sol and something older. Something underneath. like paper stored too long. Diane directed from the hallway. That box goes to Goodwill. That one's trash. Don't mix them up. She said it the way she'd said everything my entire life, as though the greatest risk in any situation was that I might do it wrong. I moved through the upstairs bedrooms in silence. Megan's room still had her debate team trophies on the shelf. Mine had been converted to a sewing room 14 years ago. I carried a bag of fabric scraps down to the garage and came back up for another load. The hallway closet was open. The quilts had shifted. And there, on the top shelf, exactly where it had been 26 years ago, was the cedar box. Same dark grain, same brass latch. My mother was in the kitchen. I could hear the faucet running. I stood in the hallway and smelled the cedar, warm, dry, slightly sweet. And I was 8 years old again, except this time I didn't have anyone's hand to stop mine. I opened the box. Inside, a pale yellow knitted hat, small enough to fit in my palm. The yarn was soft and slightly pilled, the kind someone had made by hand, stitch by stitch, for a baby who was supposed to wear it. Beneath the hat, a hospital bracelet. The plastic had yellowed, but the print was still legible. Townsend, baby boy. November 3rd, 1991. Beneath the bracelet, a footprint card, tiny ink prints, smaller than my thumb, and a name, handwritten in ballpoint, Caleb Townsend. I held the card and read the name twice. Caleb. I had a brother. A brother who had lived long enough to be measured and named and printed, and then didn't. November, 1991. Diane would have been 28. Megan was 3. I wasn't born yet. Nobody had ever mentioned him. Not at Thanksgiving, not at Christmas, not in the thousands of hours I'd spent at that dining table watching my mother perform the role of a woman who had 2 daughters and a husband and a pension and nothing else to discuss. I put the hat back in the box. I put the bracelet back. I held the footprint card a moment longer, running my thumb over the name. Caleb. Then I placed it inside, closed the lid, and pushed the box back behind the quilts. I didn't confront my mother. I didn't take anything. I walked down the stairs, helped load 3 more bags into the car, and drove home in silence with my hands at 10 and 2. But the question was already forming, the way questions always form for me. Not as an emotion, but as a variable. If my mother had carried a baby to term and lost him, and if her daughter carried a translocation inherited from a parent, then what had really happened in November of 1991? I called Aunt Linda the next day. Linda Pierce, my mother's younger sister, the one who always brought banana bread to family dinners and never once asked me why I didn't have children yet. She was the Townsend sibling who listened instead of declared. I drove to her house. She made coffee in a percolator that looked older than I was and set 2 mugs on her kitchen table. I didn't know how to ask, so I just said it. Who was Caleb? Linda put her mug down. Slowly, like she was setting something breakable on a hard surface. Your mother told you? No. I found the box. She exhaled. Not a sigh. Something deeper. Something held for years. Caleb was your brother. Full term. Or nearly. The cord. They said it was the cord. But your mother never believed that. She paused. And there were others before him. 2. Maybe 3. Early. Before Megan even. Your mother never carried them long enough to name. I sat with that. 3 or 4 losses. Then Megan, who survived. Then Caleb, who didn't. Then me. She never spoke about it? Linda shook her head. Your mother never grieved out loud. So she grieved at you. She said it without cruelty. Like she'd been waiting a long time to explain something she'd watched happen and couldn't stop. Diane had buried Caleb in the hallway closet and built a life on top of him. A life where one daughter was perfect and the other was a project, and the box on the top shelf stayed closed. I thanked Linda. I drove home. I opened my laptop and pulled up the chromosome diagram Dr. Hale had shown me. 2 segments, swapped. Inherited from a parent. The variable I'd been looking for had a name, and the name was in that cedar box. Here's what I knew. My mother had lost at least 3 pregnancies and 1 near-term baby before I was born. I carried a balanced translocation that caused recurrent pregnancy loss. That translocation was inherited, most commonly from the mother. I didn't need a medical degree to draw the line. I needed what I'd always been good at, connecting the data point nobody wanted to look at. Diane likely carried the same rearrangement. She'd probably carried it her entire life. Her losses in the late 1980s, Caleb in 1991, they fit the exact pattern Dr. Hale had described. Unbalanced embryos, pregnancies that couldn't sustain, all from the same invisible source, passed from mother to daughter to the next generation of grief. And she'd never told me. She'd watched me struggle for 6 years. She'd heard me deflect questions at dinner and show up to holidays with circles under my eyes and long sleeves over bruised elbows. She knew what loss looked like. She'd lived it. And instead of saying, "I understand," or "This happened to me too," or even, "I'm sorry," she'd said, "Some women just aren't meant for it." I could have been angry. The data supported anger. But anger is sloppy. Anger misfiles things, blurs columns, rounds numbers that need to be exact. So instead, I sat at my desk, opened a clean spreadsheet, and drafted a timeline. Diane's losses. Caleb. My own. The translocation. PGT-IVF. I didn't want revenge. I wanted what I'd wanted since the first loss. An answer clear enough that no one could dismiss it. I was going to ask Dr. Hale to write a letter. Plain English. No jargon. Short enough to read out loud at a dinner table. We started PGT-IVF the following month. The process was brutal and precise. Exactly my kind of thing. Hormone injections, egg retrieval, fertilization, then the part that made it different from everything we'd tried before. Genetic screening of each embryo. Of the 9 embryos that developed, 3 came back normal. 3 chances. The odds had never been this clear. Dr. Hale and I sat in her office after the results, and I asked her for something unusual. "I'd like you to write a letter. For my family." She looked at me over her glasses. "What kind of letter?" "The kind that explains what happened to me in language my mother would understand. The diagnosis, the cause, where it came from." Dr. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled a legal pad from her drawer. "How long?" 3 paragraphs. She wrote it the same week. I read it once in her office, folded it into thirds, and put it in my coat pocket. I didn't read it again. I knew what it said. Paragraph 1, the pregnancy status. Paragraph 2, the translocation diagnosis and what it meant. Paragraph 3, the inheritance pattern. That this condition is passed through the maternal line. 3 paragraphs. Each one a sentence my mother had spent 35 years making sure no one would ever say out loud. I almost didn't ask for that letter. For 34 years, I'd been told to keep my head down and stop making things awkward. If you've ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace at your own table, stay with me, because the next part is where I stopped. Hit subscribe if you've been there too. The first transfer failed. The embryo didn't implant. I updated my spreadsheet, booked the next appointment, and didn't tell anyone. The second transfer took. 2 weeks later, a blood test confirmed what 6 years of trying had never produced: a viable pregnancy. HCG levels rising, doubling every 48 hours the way the textbooks said they should. Daniel was standing in the kitchen when I told him. He was holding a spatula. He set it down on the counter and put both hands on my shoulders and looked at me and said nothing for a very long time. Then, it worked. 2 words. The truest sentence either of us had spoken in years. We went for the first ultrasound at 7 weeks. Dr. Hale turned the monitor toward us and pointed to a flickering spot the size of a grain of rice. "That's the heartbeat." I looked at the screen and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since the first loss. Not hope exactly, but the absence of bracing for the worst. It was like standing up after crouching for so long my legs had forgotten they could straighten. We passed 8 weeks, then 10, then 12. Each milestone felt like crossing a bridge that had held for other people, but never for me. At 14 weeks, Dr. Hale said the words I'd stopped believing I'd hear. "You're past the risk window. This pregnancy is progressing normally." I sat in her office and nodded and said thank you, and walked to my car and sat in the hospital parking garage with the engine off, and for the first time in 6 years, I let myself think the word daughter. I didn't tell my family. Not yet. Daniel asked once, gently, over dinner. When are you going to call your mom? I cut a piece of chicken and chewed it carefully. When I'm ready. He nodded. He didn't push. He understood that ready didn't mean what it meant for other people. It didn't mean a cute announcement or a pair of tiny shoes in a gift box. It meant I'd decided exactly how much of myself I was willing to hand them, knowing they'd find a way to make it small. I went to Sunday dinners. I wore loose shirts. I ate whatever Diane served and deflected questions about work, and smiled when Megan talked about her patients and said nothing about the life growing inside me that was, for the first time, growing correctly. 16 weeks. 18. 20. The anatomy scan showed a healthy girl. I saw her spine on the screen, each vertebra like a pearl on a string, and I thought, you are not going to sit at that table and feel the way I felt. I kept the sonogram in my wallet behind my insurance card. When Diane asked if I was gaining weight at a Sunday dinner, her eyes sweeping over me with the calibrated disappointment of a woman who'd been measuring her daughters since birth, I smiled and said I'd been eating more pasta. Megan glanced at me, just for a second. Something moved behind her eyes that I couldn't place, not suspicion. Something closer to recognition. Like she saw something in me she didn't want to see in herself. She looked away fast. I filed it. Megan called me on a Tuesday night. It was late, after 10, and she never called me unless Diane had asked her to relay a message. Her voice sounded wrong, thin at the edges like fabric stretched too far. Are you busy? She asked. No. A long pause. Greg and I are having trouble. Greg was her husband, orthopedic surgeon, country club membership, the kind of man Diane approved of because his name looked good in a Christmas card. What kind of trouble? I asked. Another pause. The kind I don't want to talk about at Mom's dinner table. She didn't say more. She didn't have to. I could hear it in the architecture of her silence, the same silence I'd built around myself for 6 years. Megan, the brilliant one, the doctor, the daughter who got everything right, was cracking. And she'd called me. Not Diane, not a colleague, not a friend from medical school. Me. The sister she dismissed for 30 years. I wanted to feel vindicated. I didn't. I felt tired. I'm sorry, Megan, I said. And I meant it. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been the first honest thing she'd said to me in a decade. Don't tell Mom. I won't. We hung up. I sat on the couch and put my hand on my stomach and felt my daughter move for the first time. A tiny flutter, low and to the left, like a page turning underwater. The timing was accidental, but the contrast wasn't. Megan was coming apart in private. I was coming together. And in 3 weeks, at the dinner my mother had planned to celebrate Megan's new partnership at the practice and Diane's own retirement, I was going to stand up and say 2 words. I chose the dinner. Not because I wanted an audience. I'd spent my whole life avoiding one. I chose it because the people who'd decided I was worthless had done it in public, over meals, in front of relatives who nodded along. The label was built at family tables. It could be unmade at one. The dinner was scheduled for the first Saturday in April. Diane's retirement from teaching, Megan's new partnership. A double celebration because in the Townsend family, Diane and Megan were always the double headline and I was always the paragraph no one read. I told Daniel the plan. He listened. You're sure? I'm sure. What do you need from me? When I look at you, nod. He built a spice rack that week. Oak, dovetail joints, no nails. When Daniel is processing something, the joints get tighter. The morning of the dinner, I stood in front of the mirror and buttoned my coat. My stomach was visible now. 26 weeks. Too far along to hide. I reached into the right pocket and felt the letter. It had been there since the day Dr. Hale wrote it. Folded into thirds, slightly soft at the creases from the number of times I'd touched it without opening it. I didn't need to open it. I knew every sentence. I folded that letter into my coat pocket and practiced reading it in the car until my voice stopped shaking. I wasn't going to yell. I was just going to read. If you're rooting for me to finally say it out loud, drop a single word in the comments. Read. I'll see it. Now let's go to dinner. Diane's house smelled like roast and pine sol and the cedar that always lived underneath, the scent that had lived in the hallway closet for 35 years. She'd set the dining room up for 22. The good china, ivory with a gold rim, used twice a year, washed by hand. Real cloth napkins. A centerpiece of white lilies because Diane believed flowers belonged at celebrations the way credentials belonged on a wall. The guest list: Roger, Megan, Greg, Aunt Linda, Uncle Paul, 4 cousins, 2 in-laws, and a handful of Diane's retired colleagues. Every seat assigned. Mine was between Uncle Paul and a former vice principal named Dorothy, which told me exactly where I ranked in my mother's seating chart, between someone who wouldn't talk to me and someone who wouldn't notice. Daniel sat across the table. He'd worn his good jacket, the one he saved for funerals and anniversaries. He looked at me when we sat down and gave a small nod. Not the nod, not yet, just a check-in. I'm here. The room was warm, voices layered, Megan accepting congratulations, Diane narrating her 31 years of teaching to anyone who'd listen, Roger opening a second bottle of wine without saying a word. I sat in my chair with my coat on the back of it, the letter in the right pocket, and I ate my salad and listened to my family celebrate the 2 women they'd always been proud of. The hallway closet was 12 feet from where I sat. Behind the quilts, the cedar box held its silence. Caleb's footprint card waited where I'd placed it back. Everything in that house was exactly where my mother had put it, including me. Diane tapped her glass at 8:15. The room quieted. She stood at the head of the table in a cream blouse and the pearl earrings she wore to church and looked out over her family with the expression of a woman who had arranged every detail and expected every detail to hold. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. 31 years in the classroom, and I can finally say, I'm done telling other people's children what to do. Polite laughter. She turned to Megan. And to my daughter, my Megan, who just made partner at Ridgeline Women's Health. We always knew you'd get there. She raised her glass. The table followed. Megan smiled. Greg squeezed her shoulder. Linda raised her glass quietly. Roger poured himself more wine. I watched from my assigned seat, my hand resting on the napkin in my lap, and waited. This was the pattern. Diane would toast Megan. The room would applaud. Then someone would bring out dessert, and the evening would fold into small talk and compliments until everyone went home and the good china went back into the cabinet for another 6 months. That was how it always went. The celebration, the roles, the script. Megan at center stage, Tracy in the margins. Except tonight I had a coat on the back of my chair with a letter in the pocket, and a 26-week-old daughter who had never heard anyone call her mother dumb. Daniel caught my eye across the table. His hands were folded on the placemat. Calm. I took a breath. I put my napkin on the table. I stood up. 22 faces turned toward me, and I said the 2 words I'd waited 6 years to say. I'm pregnant. The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of someone finishing a toast. The real kind. The kind where forks stop moving and ice settles in glasses and you can hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. 22 people looked at me. I looked at my mother. Diane's face did something I'd seen 1,000 times. The recalibration. The quick pass behind the eyes where she sorted what she'd just heard into the categories she kept for me. Inconvenience, embarrassment, or irrelevance. It took her less than 3 seconds. She picked up her wine glass. Well? A sip. Then. Let's hope this one is smarter than you. 9 words. Same cadence she'd used on report cards and spelling tests, and the night I told her I'd been accepted to the hospital's analytics program. Same dismissal, same delivery, same message. Whatever you do, Tracy, it won't be enough. Megan was sitting to Diane's left. She put her hand over her mouth, but not fast enough to hide the smile. At least now she won't be the only disappointment in the family. She said it to Diane, not to me, like I wasn't even in the room, like my child was already a punchline. Roger reached for the bread basket. He didn't look up. Can we eat now? 22 relatives. Not one of them spoke. Aunt Linda had her hand flat on the table. Uncle Paul stared at his plate. Dorothy, the vice principal, cleared her throat and said nothing. The room waited for me to sit down, to fold myself back into the margins the way I always had. I looked across the table at Daniel. His hands were still folded. His eyes were steady. He nodded. I didn't sit down. I reached behind me, slipped my hand into my coat pocket, and felt the letter. The paper was soft at the folds. I'd carried it for 11 weeks. Through grocery stores and staff meetings and ultrasound appointments, and the 20-minute drive to this house where I'd spent 30 years being made small, I pulled it out, unfolded it. The room watched. I could feel 22 sets of eyes and the particular silence of people who are not sure whether they're witnessing a scene or a breakdown. Diane's face had shifted, not to concern, not yet, but to the controlled alarm of a woman who suspects the script is about to change and hasn't been given the new pages. What is that? She asked. Her voice was sharp, the voice she'd used when I reached for the cedar box at 8 years old. It's a letter, I said. My voice was even. I'd practiced that. From my obstetrician, Dr. Renata Hale. She's a specialist in recurrent pregnancy loss. The word recurrent landed on the table like a stone in a pond. Megan's smile disappeared. Roger put down the bread. I spent 6 years trying to have a baby, I said. I lost 5 pregnancies. I never told any of you because I knew what you'd say. I looked at Diane. I know what you just said. My mother opened her mouth. I held up one hand, the same hand she'd slapped the cedar box out of when I was a child. I'd like to read the letter now, I said. All of it. And then I'll sit down. The room was completely still. Daniel's hands were folded on the placemat, steady as the table he'd built for our kitchen. I looked at the first line. I read, Dear Tracy, I'm writing this letter at your request so that you may share it with your family. Your current pregnancy is healthy, viable, and progressing normally at 26 weeks. Your daughter is developing on schedule and all indicators are strong. I paused. Not for effect. For breath. 22 people listened. My mother's hands were flat on the tablecloth. I continued. Over the past 6 years, you have experienced 5 pregnancy losses. After extensive testing, we identified the cause. You carry a balanced reciprocal translocation involving chromosomes 7 and 11. This is a structural chromosomal rearrangement that does not affect your own health, but creates a high probability of genetically unbalanced embryos during reproduction. This is not a lifestyle factor. It is not caused by stress, diet, timing, or personal failure. It is a documented, identifiable medical condition that has been present in your DNA since birth. I heard someone exhale. I didn't look up. I read the third paragraph. This type of translocation is inherited, passed from parent to child. Given your family history, including documented pregnancy losses in the previous generation, the clinical evidence strongly indicates you inherited this condition from your mother. I stopped reading. I didn't need to say anything else. The sentence did what sentences do when they carry the weight of 35 years of silence. It sat in the middle of the room and waited for someone to look at it. Diane looked at it. Her face changed. Not the recalibration I'd seen 1,000 times. Something underneath. Something old and terrified and raw, like wallpaper peeling back to show the plaster beneath. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Then her eyes filled. Not the careful, dignified tears she produced at retirement speeches and church services. These were the other kind. The kind that come from the place you thought you'd sealed shut. By the third sentence, my mother was crying. The table understood before Diane did. You could see it moving through them. Linda first, then Paul, then the cousins. The slow recognition of what passed through the maternal line actually meant. It meant Diane carried it. It meant Diane's losses, the ones nobody talked about, the ones buried in a cedar box on the top shelf of a hallway closet, had the same invisible cause. It meant the woman who had spent 6 years calling her daughter a disappointment for failing to carry a pregnancy had passed down the very condition that made those pregnancies fail. Diane's hands were trembling on the tablecloth. The tears were coming fast now, uncontrolled, the kind that make your breath hitch in ugly intervals. "You don't understand," she said. Her voice cracked. I had a... She couldn't finish. The name she hadn't said in 35 years was stuck in her throat like a bone. Linda put a hand on her sister's arm. "Tell her, Diane. For once, tell the truth." Diane shook her head. She pressed both palms against her eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't know it was... that it could..." She was talking to no one. To the table, to the ceiling, to the son she'd put in a cedar box and never spoken of again. Megan sat frozen. The color had left her face. She was a doctor, an OBGYN. She had spent 8 years in medical training and a career delivering other women's babies, and she had never once considered that her own sister's recurrent losses might have a chromosomal cause. She hadn't asked. She hadn't looked. She'd laughed. Roger stared at his plate. His watch hand stayed at his side. For the first time in my memory, he didn't check the time. I folded the letter. 3 creases. The same way I'd folded it 11 weeks ago in Dr. Hale's office. I put it back in my coat pocket. I didn't say, "You gave this to me?" I didn't say, "You could have warned me." I didn't say, "Caleb." I didn't say any of the things a person says when they've earned the right to be cruel, because cruelty was their language. It had never been mine. Diane was still crying, the kind of crying that empties a room or fills it, depending on who you are. Megan reached for her water glass and missed. Roger's jaw worked like he was chewing something he couldn't swallow. The 22 relatives sat in the specific silence of people watching a family story rewrite itself in real time. I looked at my mother. I kept my voice level, the way I keep my voice when I'm reading numbers that don't lie. She doesn't have to be smart. She doesn't have to be the best. She just has to be loved. I put my napkin on the table. Daniel stood. He walked around to my side, pulled out my chair, and put his hand on the small of my back. We walked to the front door. Behind us, someone, Linda, I think, said something soft I couldn't hear. Diane called my name. I heard it. I didn't turn around. Not because I was angry, because I'd said everything the letter had to say, and everything after that was hers to carry. Daniel opened the car door. I sat down. He got in on his side. We pulled out of the driveway in silence, and I held my hand against my stomach and felt my daughter move. 3 weeks passed. Nobody called. Then Linda did. She left a voicemail. "Tracy, I just want you to know. You were right to say it. And I should have said it years ago." She paused. "Your mother's not okay. But that's not your job." I saved the message. A cousin I barely knew sent a text. "You were incredibly brave. I never knew about any of it." Megan didn't call. Not the first week. Not the second. On the 23rd day, a text appeared. "Can we talk?" I waited 2 days and wrote back. "When you're ready to be honest, yes." Diane tried once. Not a phone call, a letter. Handwritten, 2 pages, the penmanship perfect because she was a teacher, and teachers don't send sloppy letters even when they're falling apart. Most of it was about her, about how hard it had been to lose Caleb, about how she didn't have the language for grief in 1991, about how she'd always been afraid I'd turn out like her, and how that fear had come out wrong. She didn't apologize. She didn't say the word sorry. What she did say at the end was, "I would like to meet my granddaughter. When you're ready." Daniel read the letter. "She's still making it about her." "I know. What do you want to do?" I thought about it for a week. Then I wrote back, short. "You can be in her life. But it starts with the truth. All of it. Including Caleb's name." Diane didn't respond for 11 days. Then a single line. His name was Caleb James Townsend. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't enough, but it was the first honest sentence my mother had written me in 34 years. And I decided that was a place to start. She was born on a Tuesday in August at 6:42 a.m., 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Dr. Hale delivered her. Daniel cut the cord. The nurse placed her on my chest and she opened her eyes and looked at me with the unfocused curiosity of someone arriving somewhere new and deciding whether to stay. I held her and I thought about the pale yellow knitted hat in the cedar box and the brother I never met and the 5 pregnancies that ended before this one began. I thought about the spreadsheet with the outcome column that finally, on this row, read something other than negative. I thought about my mother's hands trembling on the tablecloth. I kept the cedar box. Diane had left it on my porch. No note. The brass latch polished for the first time in decades. Inside, Caleb's hat and bracelet and footprint card. I put it on the shelf in my daughter's room. Not hidden, not behind quilts. Just there, where the light could reach it. I spent 34 years trying to be smart enough to earn a love that was never going to come on my terms. And it turned out the smartest thing I ever did was stop trying to prove myself to people who decided my value before I was born, and just love her instead. That's my story. 6 years, 1 letter, and 3 sentences that finally said what no one in my family would. If you've ever been the one they decided about before you could speak, let me say it plainly. Their verdict was never the truth. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.